Is BCH going to be the next in a line of coins that die from lack of care? There seems to be a funding crisis, but this isn't an issue that's just affecting Bitcoin Cash. We see it across the crypto space and in the open source world at large. Let's start by talking about open source funding in general, and then we'll talk about the specifics of the latest BCH funding proposal and what we might learn from other communities like Bitcoin, Zcash, and Dash, and from the open source world. Feel free to skip ahead at any time and look at specific funding models. Open source is a pretty new concept. It was made possible by the internet, and it didn't really exist prior to that. We're really still trying to figure out how it works, and the fact that it has worked in some cases is still kind of a shock because it's complicated and it relies on an intricate balance of incentives. Many people tend to think of open source projects as being developed by passionate volunteers, but some of the most successful open source projects are mostly developed by people who are paid by their employers to contribute. For example, the Linux kernel. Since 2005, some 14,000 individual developers from over 1,300 different companies have contributed to the kernel. Major corporations include Dell, IBM, HP, Oracle, and Nokia, and the number of unpaid contributors is declining. It went from 14.6% in 2012 to 7.7% of all contributions in 2016. So why do corporations pay developers to just work on open source projects? Well, first, they might find the software valuable and they don't want it to be co-opted. If Dell just left IBM to do all the contributing, you can bet that IBM will start making alterations that work to their advantage and to the detriment of other companies. So to create a balance, many companies contribute so that the code doesn't get biased too far in one direction. Then there are instances where companies fund work on open source projects not because it helps their bottom line, but as an indulgence for their programmers and more of a recruiting tool. It's a more cynical view, but that does happen too. But regardless of the motivation, what you end up with is multiple companies that function as stakeholders. They all have a seat at the table in deciding the direction of the project, and they all contribute code by funding developers. But it's not automatically this purely decentralized process. In some cases, the balance is heavily weighted towards a certain company. Take React Native, for example, open source technology with really healthy contributions spread across the open source community, but it was created by Facebook, which is a behemoth, and they fund many developers just to focus on React Native. They would definitely have the power to take the code in any direction that they wanted if it favored them, even if it were to the detriment of the rest of the community. The open source community relies on a careful balance of incentives to stop them doing this. Facebook might not want to risk losing all the beneficial contributions from the community, so they see it in their interest to be cooperative, so that there is no fork in the code base. In crypto, Bitcoin has grown large enough that it started to attract this model of funding, as it's in the financial best interest of many companies to see it succeed. Initially, it was largely Blockstream that funded development, but now we're seeing other companies provide contributors also, including MIT, Square, Zappo, Binance, Chaincode Labs, and others. But even with this growing number of companies funding Bitcoin, it too struggles. Bitcoin is large enough that it can attract many competing companies to fund developers. Many projects just rely on developers donating their time voluntarily. But if you're just asking a developer to volunteer their time, you're actually asking them to donate hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. This fact is ignored by many because actual money doesn't change hands, but the reality is there is a huge opportunity cost for these developers to give their time to a project. In my opinion, the time donated by devs in the crypto space is largely underappreciated. Another way to subsidize voluntary developers is to crowdsource donations, but hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover just a single developer is very difficult to crowdfund or solicit through donations. And when we look at the reality of that model, it's not sustainable, as Chris Pacia, lead dev for OpenBazaar, mentioned in a recent interview with me.
I was arguing with someone on this topic, and he listed out a number of software programs open source, and he's like, well, they all run on donations. First one I looked at was GIMP. I looked at like one of the software developers, he had like a Patreon account. He was earning like less than poverty level wages. So I'm like, that's not a particularly good example.
By comparison, it's been very beneficial for projects like Zcash to have a founder's reward, despite all the flack Zcash gets because of this. But the Zcash community itself seems to be a big fan of this. Zcash, based on the Zero Cash protocol, was originally conceptualized as an extension to the Bitcoin protocol, but it was never added because it was too experimental. So the writers of the protocol reached out to Zuko to see if this could be created in its own right. And Zcash was born. But to get there, again, required enormous funds because high-end cryptography experts and developers don't come cheap. Investors were involved to cover the costs of research and development, and baked into the Zcash protocol was a dividend of sorts. 20% of coins mined for the first 4 years would go towards paying these investors back and funding development. And after 4 years, the reward would be automatically sunsetted. Now, for an investor to enter a deal like this, they would have really had to believe that Zcash was going to work, so that these Zcash tokens would actually be worth something. Zcash pioneered 2 new concepts in their project: zero knowledge and the founder's reward. Both proved incredibly successful. The funding allowed Zcash to recruit top-level engineers to implement this cutting-edge tech. And since implementation, the developers have made huge strides in efficiency, taking a computationally expensive protocol that required up to 3.2 gigabytes of memory to generate to just 40 megabytes. Minezcash, an OG Zcash community member, remarks that the founder's reward was absolutely necessary to get Zcash off the ground, but the sunsetting was the best part of it, because it allowed the community to evaluate the project down the track and potentially change direction if needed. Minezcash also has noticed how community donations are good in theory, but it's always really difficult to raise enough funds via this method. But seeing the success of their own funding model and how other chains struggle to find money to cover infrastructure development, the Zcash community has since voted to reintroduce another inbuilt funding model. They've allocated 7% of new coins to Electric Coin Company to put towards development, 5% to the Zcash Foundation, a completely separate 501c3 that will determine themselves how their funding will be allocated, and a further 8% to grants to fund development, which is a great way for new developers to enter the Zcash ecosystem. And they're looking for new people. But deciding on this proposal took over a year of polling and surveying the community and listening to extensive feedback. Engagement with the community was crucial, and although they successfully came to a resolution, getting there was an involved process. So this brings me to the Dash model, as their voting model seems even more streamlined, and it's cool to see a successful DAO operational. In Dash, 10% of coins mined are earmarked, and masternode operators vote on how the DAO should distribute these funds, and any Dash not allocated simply isn't created. This provides an inbuilt funding model for developers, and if there are funds left over, they can go to other projects like marketing campaigns, social outreach, or other things that the community finds important. The Dash network could decide that if the developers are misbehaving, then they could fire that team and hire another team if that's what they wanted. The network could even fund competing teams at the same time to provide for a smooth transition between teams. Again, this inbuilt funding has been a huge help to the Dash ecosystem, as they were able to keep supporting development even during the downturns in the market that pushed many of their competitors to the sidelines. And their method for incorporating community feedback seems like one of the best out there. So recently, a new funding plan was proposed for BCH. The CEO of one of the largest mining pools on Bitcoin Cash released a proposal that 12.5% of BCH miner awards would go into a fund that will support Bitcoin Cash infrastructure. This wouldn't be in perpetuity like Dash or for 4 years like Zcash, but it would sunset after 6 months. This would go towards critical infrastructure development, and the idea is that this development needs to be done now because they anticipate an upcoming bull market and want to make sure that the chain is ready. And in order to make sure that the whole mining community does this and there's no tragedy of the commons, miners will orphan BCH blocks that do not follow the plan. Now, this plan was received largely with hostility, as many perceived it as miners forcing changes on the network without any discussion. Engagement and community cohesion is crucial in the process of a community deciding how to implement a sustainable funding model, but cohesion is something that BCH has had a bit of trouble with.
A lot of, like infighting and weird stuff going on. And the selling point around BCH is not as strong as it could be. Everybody is pulling in a different direction. The crypto people are going to be like, oh, this is cool, this is decentralized, and there is some truth to that, but there are different ways to achieve decentralization. At some point, you get to some community consensus, and then everybody commit to it and you create a sharing point around that stuff.
Since the IFP was first introduced, there have been many alternative proposals suggested. Now, what BCH doesn't lack is better proposals, but instead any sort of community consensus in favour of one of these proposals over the other. It seems like a situation of 100 people with 100 different proposals, and the community seems more fractured than ever. The biggest issue people have isn't that they don't believe developer funding is needed.
The technology is evolving extremely quickly, and you need to keep up with that pace for everything to keep working.
The difference between a developer and a non-developer is developers automatically get code rot, the concept of code rot, because they deal with it every day.
But the issue is that this seems like a sudden move, and one that is being rammed down people's throats. But is this accurate?
Why you guys decided to add that infrastructure and funding plan into the just released client?
This is gated by an activation mechanism, which leave an option to not activate it and go for another solution, or that allows to activate it if no other solution is found. It doesn't mean that it has to activate. This is good to have the option in there. The action is actually proposing choice, and if people want to freak out about proposing choice, then they're probably not the one on the side of freedom.
It seems to me that it was a little rush to include that option on the client.
This is a demand that has been coming for China for like 2 years or so. It's not something that is new.
There's this whole Chinese community that people in America or the West are just oblivious to, and yet that's the majority of the economic power behind mining. So anybody who thinks that they're in the majority opposing this, like, just if you're going to be honest with yourself, you have to acknowledge that.
Like this being a global culture, and that's like going 100% two ways.
You need to keep in mind that those miners, they are the one funding infra right now for the most part. They are obviously very much in favor of like either an IFP or any other solution that would spread that load a bit, right? Because they are paying for most of it right now. Where they stand right now is that, as people have seen, they are not voting for it. And the reason is that because it's controversial in the West, they essentially move into like a wait and see mode. They expect us as a community to come up with alternatives if we are not happy with what they are putting on the table.
So given that it's just an option on the table, and in fact actually highly unlikely to go through, one good thing is that it's really steamrolled the conversation about funding.
It's really forced the discussion.
I'm pretty confident that in like 2 months, we're going to have made more progress in funding infrastructure than we did in 2 years before that.
To continue this discussion effectively, there needs to be a better system for polling community members and collecting feedback than just Telegram rooms where people spend their time hurling insults at each other. Now, learning from the feedback mechanisms that Zcash implemented, for example, could be really helpful.
When you do something, you need to look at previous example that have been done in the industry and try to inspire yourself from it.
And perhaps the way BCH ultimately decides to handle this could provide guidance to other coins that go through a similar situation.
I've been advocating myself that the right model is probably a Linux Foundation kind of model. And it seems that the Linux Foundation kind of model did not happen. I would prefer very much having better cards to play.
So in summary, BCH didn't have an ICO that generated a bunch of funds for the founders to sit on. They don't have an inbuilt DAO for voting and distributing earmarked funds or a founder's reward. They don't seem large enough to attract many companies to dedicate developers solely to the project. And they are disinclined to allow any single company to fund everything and capture the system. And the opportunity cost for good devs staying on this project is to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Many of these people are talented enough they could make $250,000 a year. I was talking to Ben, who is a Bitcoin Core developer, and he basically said it was like poverty level wages.
Right. Funding is of critical importance, and hopefully the community understands this and comes to an agreement about how to handle it. I personally think that we might see the coins with inbuilt funding models outcompete other coins that aren't large enough to attract an open source stakeholder model. But whichever direction the community chooses, it's important that they do come together and choose. Cohesion is needed around a plan for BCH sustainability. Otherwise, we may see a sunset on BCH also. If this happens, I at least hope the rest of the crypto community learns from it.